Part 1. The Invitation That Wasn't. When Grace announced her engagement, I was thrilled. Our relationship hadn't been perfect. Stepmother-stepdaughter dynamics rarely are, but I'd loved her like my own since marrying her father 12 years ago. I thought we'd finally reached a good place. When she introduced her fiancé, Peter, I was impressed. He was kind, funny, and clearly adored her. At dinner, when I offered to help pay for the wedding, Grace smiled and hugged me. For a moment, I thought I'd done something right. Weeks later, Grace and Peter came over to discuss the budget. She excitedly described her vision: pastel flowers, string lights, a live band. I kept my input minimal, wanting her to feel in control, but I was proud to help make her dream wedding a reality. I imagined the day, zipping up her dress, sharing nervous laughter, maybe even a heartfelt moment in her speech about the role I'd played in her life. Then the invitation arrived. Sitting at the kitchen counter, I tore into the elegant envelope, excited to see it. My heart sank as I read it. Grace's father and her biological mother, Evelyn, were listed under parents of the bride. My name wasn't there. Not as a host, not even as a guest. Confused, I texted her. "Got the beautiful invite. Was my name left off by mistake?" Her response came fast. "No mistake. Thanks for understanding." Understanding? I tried calling her, but it went to voicemail. That evening, I showed the invitation to her father, who frowned and promised to talk to her. But I couldn't wait. I dialed her again, and this time, she picked up. "Grace, why wasn't I included?" I asked carefully. "Because it didn't feel right," she said flatly. "You're not my mom, and I want the wedding to reflect that." Her words cut deep. I stammered, trying to explain how much I'd done for her, how much I cared, but she cut me off. "Thanks for helping with the wedding," she said briskly, then hung up. I stared at the invitation again, tears blurring the fancy gold script. I'd given so much to be part of her life, but it was clear I wasn't part of her wedding, or her idea of family. Part 2. The Confrontation. I stewed over Grace's words for days, the sting of her dismissal lingering like a bruise that wouldn't fade. "You're not my mom." It played on repeat in my head, each replay twisting the knife a little deeper. I kept second-guessing myself. Maybe I'd overstepped in offering to help with the wedding. Maybe I hadn't done enough to build that bond she seemed to want only with Evelyn. But no matter how much I rationalized, the hurt remained. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I asked her to come over one evening, determined to get answers face to face. Grace arrived with Peter, looking effortlessly composed, her usual confidence on full display. I envied how unbothered she seemed, as if nothing was wrong, while I felt like my chest was caving in. We sat in the living room, tension thick in the air. I started carefully, trying not to let my emotions spill out. "Grace," I said softly, "I need to understand. Why am I not part of the wedding? Why wasn't I invited at all?" She glanced at Peter, who stayed silent, clearly uncomfortable. "I just didn't think it was appropriate," she said after a pause. "It's a family event, and I want it to reflect my real family." There it was again. Real family? I forced myself to stay calm. "Grace, I've been part of your life for over a decade. I've supported you, cheered for you, loved you. Why doesn't that count as real family?" Her expression hardened. "Look, I'm grateful for everything you've done, but you're not my mom. Evelyn is my mom. She's the one who should be standing beside me on my wedding day. And yet she hasn't been there." I shot back, the frustration bubbling to the surface despite my best efforts. "Evelyn barely visited when you were growing up. She forgot birthdays, didn't come to parent-teacher conferences, and now she gets to swoop in and play the perfect mother? Grace, I've been here. I've earned the right to at least be there on your big day." Grace's face reddened, and for a moment, I thought I'd gotten through to her. But then she folded her arms and said, "This isn't about what you think you've earned. It's my wedding. I decide who's there. And I decided I want Evelyn." Her words knocked the wind out of me. So I'm good enough to pay for the wedding but not good enough to attend? I asked, my voice trembling. Peter finally spoke up, his tone conciliatory. It's not like that, he said. Grace just wants things a certain way. It's not personal. Not personal? My entire relationship with Grace was personal. Every late-night pep talk, every school project I'd stayed up to help her finish, every time I tried to balance being her friend and a parental figure, it was all personal. Grace, I said, my voice quieter now, do you realize how hurtful this is? Do you realize what you're saying to me? She shifted uncomfortably. I didn't mean to hurt you. I just want my wedding to feel right for me. I thought you'd understand. I stared at her, struggling to process how she could expect me to understand being sidelined like this. I don't understand, I admitted. But if that's what you want, then fine. I'll step back. Just know that it hurts, more than you realize. Grace didn't respond, and Peter awkwardly suggested they leave. As they headed for the door, Grace turned and said, Thanks for everything. Really. The words felt hollow, like they were meant to smooth over the wreckage she was leaving behind. After they left, I sank into the couch, numb. My husband came in and found me sitting there, staring at nothing. How did it go? He asked, though the look on my face probably told him everything. She said it wasn't personal. I muttered. It's just her wedding, and I don't belong in her idea of family. He sighed heavily and sat down beside me. She'll regret this one day, he said, putting a hand on my shoulder. You've done more for her than anyone. Will she? I asked, my voice cracking. Or will she just keep telling herself I wasn't her real mom? I didn't have the energy to cry anymore. All I could do was sit there, wondering how the girl I'd poured so much love into could so easily cast me aside. Part 3. Evelyn's role. If Grace's words had cut me, Evelyn's involvement twisted the knife. Evelyn, her biological mother, had barely been present in her life. After the divorce, she moved across the country, only showing up occasionally. I was the one who stayed, who raised Grace through her formative years. Now, Evelyn was front and center at the wedding I was paying for, and I couldn't understand it. I called Evelyn, hoping for some clarity. She answered cheerfully, as if she hadn't abandoned Grace for most of her life. She asked me to come, Evelyn said casually when I brought up my exclusion. I'm her mother. It's her day, she gets to decide. She didn't raise her, I replied, frustration creeping into my voice. I've been here for Grace through everything. And now I'm not even invited? Evelyn laughed lightly, brushing me off. Maybe she just wants her real mom there. You have to respect that. That phrase, real mom, stung more than anything. Grace had cried countless times over Evelyn's absences. Now, Evelyn was being rewarded for simply showing up. The final blow came when I overheard Grace tell her father. Mom's walking me down the aisle. Evelyn? He asked, clearly surprised. Of course, she said, as though it were obvious. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Evelyn was taking the role I'd dreamed of, despite years of neglect. That night I told my husband, I don't think I can keep paying for this wedding. You've already paid for most of it, he said gently. Pulling out now will only make things worse. He wasn't wrong, but it didn't make it hurt any less. Evelyn hadn't earned her place, but Grace had chosen her anyway. I told myself to let it go, for Grace's sake. But deep down, I wondered if I'd ever truly been part of her family. Part 4. The Financial Dilemma. After the confrontation with Grace and the sting of Evelyn's sudden saintly status, I found myself questioning everything. Why was I paying for a wedding I wasn't even invited to? Was I enabling Grace's behavior by staying silent? Every invoice that came through felt like a slap in the face. The venue deposit alone was astronomical, followed by catering, flowers, the band, and even the makeup artist Grace had booked for the day. Each bill carried the weight of my exclusion. With every payment, I felt less like a stepmother and more like a faceless sponsor. One night, after reviewing yet another invoice, I snapped. That's it. I told my husband. I'm done. I'm not paying another dime for this wedding. He looked up from his chair, startled. You're serious? Dead serious, I said, throwing the bill onto the counter. This isn't just about money, it's about respect. Grace has made it clear I'm not part of this wedding, and I'm tired of being treated like an ATM. He sighed and set his book down. I get it. I really do. But pulling out now, it's going to blow everything up. Do you really want that? I hesitated. As much as I wanted to stand my ground, I couldn't ignore the potential fallout. Grace would be furious. Her father would be caught in the middle. And the wedding, which she dreamed of, could end up a disaster. But wasn't that on her? Hadn't she created this situation by excluding me? I can't keep pretending this doesn't hurt, I said, my voice softer now. It's humiliating. She's walking Evelyn down the aisle. She's pretending I don't exist. And I'm supposed to just keep funding this like nothing's wrong? He reached for my hand. I know it's not fair. But if you stop now, it'll only reinforce what she already thinks, that you're not really part of the family. Maybe the better thing to do is take the high road. Let her have her day, and maybe one day she'll realize what she's done. His words hung heavy in the air. I hated the idea of giving Grace more reasons to resent me. Still, the idea of continuing to pay for everything felt like swallowing broken glass. The next morning, as I reviewed the payment schedule for the wedding planner, I found myself staring at the total cost. It was more money than I'd spent on my first car, and I wasn't even getting so much as a seat at the event. I thought about what I could do with that money. A vacation. Renovating the kitchen. Donating to a cause that actually appreciated my help. But then I thought about Grace. This was her big day, the culmination of her dreams. Would pulling my funding ruin her wedding? Or would it finally force her to realize that actions have consequences? I decided to confront her one last time. When I called, she answered with her usual breezy tone. Hi. What's up? I need to talk to you about the wedding, I said firmly. She paused, her tone shifting. Okay, what about it? I'm struggling to keep paying for something I'm not even invited to, I said. Do you understand how hurtful this is for me? Grace sighed loudly, as if I were being unreasonable. I don't see why this is such a big deal. You said you wanted to help with the wedding? I wanted to help because I thought I'd be part of it, I replied. But you've excluded me completely. You didn't even invite me, Grace. Do you know how that feels? It's not about feelings, she said dismissively. It's about what's right for me. And I don't feel like it's your place to be there. You're not my mom. You don't need to take this so personally. Hearing her say it out loud again shattered the last shred of hope I'd been holding on to. Grace, I said slowly, this isn't just about me. It's about respect. I've supported you in every way I could. I've been there for you when Evelyn wasn't. And now, when it's your turn to show me a little kindness, you've pushed me aside. She didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was defensive. I'm sorry if you feel that way, but this is my wedding. I'm not changing anything. I hung up the phone feeling defeated. That night, I told my husband I'd continue to pay for the wedding, but it wasn't for Grace anymore, it was for me. I didn't want to carry the guilt of ruining her big day. But as I wrote the next check, I made a promise to myself. This was the last time I'd let her take me for granted. If she wanted Evelyn to fill the role of mother, then she could have her, baggage and all. And me? I'd finally let go of trying to win her approval. Part 5. The day of the wedding. The morning of the wedding felt surreal. The house was quiet, almost eerily so. Grace and her bridal party had stayed at a hotel the night before, leaving behind none of the usual chaos and excitement that should accompany a wedding day. The silence was a sharp reminder. I wasn't part of this. I busied myself with meaningless tasks, folding laundry, scrolling through my phone, even reorganizing the spice rack, anything to keep my mind off what was happening. I pictured Grace in her gown, surrounded by her friends, laughing and getting ready. I imagined Evelyn by her side, offering her last-minute advice, pretending to be the mother she hadn't been for years. Around noon, my husband came downstairs, dressed in his suit. He adjusted his tie in the mirror, his expression a mix of guilt and discomfort. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, glancing at me. I forced a smile. "Go. Don't let this ruin her day." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'll be back as soon as it's over." I watched him leave, the door clicking shut behind him, and the reality of the situation finally sank in. The wedding was happening. The day I'd helped pay for, planned for, and dreamed of sharing with Grace was unfolding without me. I sat down on the couch and stared at the silence around me. This wasn't how I imagined it, this hollow feeling of being left behind. To distract myself, I pulled out old photo albums and flipped through them. There were pictures of Grace at her school plays, at birthday parties, at family vacations. In every one of them, I was there. I was the one who took the photos, baked the cakes, planned the trips. But now, it was as if none of it had mattered. I couldn't help but wonder what was happening at the wedding. Was Evelyn soaking up the attention? Was Grace thinking of me at all? I imagined the moment when Grace would walk down the aisle, Evelyn on her arm, smiling as though she'd been there all along. The thought made my chest tighten. The hours dragged on. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to go for a drive. Anything to avoid sitting in that house, feeling like an afterthought. I ended up at a park, watching families with their kids playing on the swings and throwing frisbees. Seeing their joy only deepened my sadness. When I returned home, the house was just as empty as I'd left it. My husband finally walked through the door that evening, looking exhausted. He loosened his tie and slumped into a chair without saying a word. "How was it?" I asked, dreading the answer. "It was fine," he said, carefully choosing his words. "Did she seem happy?" "Yes," he said, but there was something in his tone that made me press further. "Did anyone ask about me?" I asked, hating how vulnerable the question made me feel. He hesitated before answering. "Not really. Evelyn, well, she made sure the focus was on her. She gave a little speech about how proud she was of Grace." "Of course she did." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I hope it was everything Grace wanted." He leaned forward, his voice soft. "She didn't thank Evelyn in her speech, you know. She thanked me. And she hesitated. Like she wanted to say something about you but didn't. It didn't make me feel better. If anything, it felt worse. Grace hadn't forgotten me, but she'd chosen to leave me out anyway. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the porch, staring out at the stars. The wedding was over, and so was any hope of feeling included. I told myself I'd done the right thing by taking the high road, but it didn't feel like it. It felt like I'd let Grace walk all over me one last time. Still, there was a strange sense of closure. I'd given Grace everything I could, and she'd made her choices. From here on out, I wouldn't keep chasing her approval. I wouldn't keep trying to prove my worth. If she ever wanted a real relationship, she'd have to be the one to take the first step. Until then, I was done waiting. Part 6, The Fallout. A week after the wedding, Grace and Peter came over to drop off some leftover decorations and thank my husband for all his help. The moment they walked through the door, I felt the tension. Grace avoided eye contact with me, busying herself with putting down a box of centerpieces. Peter, clearly sensing the awkwardness, offered me a strained smile. "Thanks again for helping with the wedding," Peter said, his tone polite but stiff. I nodded, forcing a tight smile. "Of course. I hope it was everything you wanted." Grace didn't say anything, just muttered something about needing to grab more boxes from the car. I could feel my frustration bubbling under the surface. This wasn't just going to be brushed aside like it hadn't happened. When she came back in, I finally spoke up. "Grace, can we talk for a minute?" She froze, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What about?" I gestured toward the living room. "Just sit down for a second." Reluctantly, she plopped onto the couch, crossing her arms like a defiant teenager. Peter lingered awkwardly by the door, clearly debating whether to stay or flee. My husband stepped in, sensing the tension, and gently said, "Peter, why don't we go grab a drink in the kitchen?" Once they left, I turned to Grace. "I need to ask, why did you leave me out of your wedding? Why wasn't I invited, Grace? After everything I've done for you, I just don't understand." She sighed dramatically. "We've been over this. I wanted it to be about family. My real family." There it was again. That phrase. It stung just as much now as it had the first time she said it. "Grace," I said quietly, "I am your family. I've been here for you for 12 years. I've supported you, loved you, and done everything I could to make you feel cared for. So please help me understand, why wasn't I good enough to be there for you on your wedding day?" Her face softened for a moment, but then she shook her head. "It's not that you weren't good enough. It's just, I don't see you the same way I see my mom. I wanted her there. I wanted it to feel normal." "Normal?" I repeated, incredulous. "What's normal about Evelyn waltzing back into your life after years of barely being present? She hasn't raised you, Grace. She wasn't there for you when you needed her most. She's still my mom," Grace shot back. "And I wanted to honor her. That's my choice." I felt the anger rising, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You have every right to make your choices, Grace. But choices have consequences. Do you have any idea how hurtful it was to be excluded from the biggest day of your life? To be treated like I didn't exist, while still being expected to pay for everything?" Her face reddened. "I never asked you to pay for it. You offered." "I offered because I thought I'd be part of it," I said firmly. "I thought I was supporting my family. Instead, I was funding a day I wasn't even allowed to attend. Do you know how humiliating that was?" Grace looked down, her expression hard to read. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, but then she said, "I didn't mean to hurt you. I just wanted things a certain way. I didn't think you'd take it so personally." "Not take it personally?" I said, my voice trembling. "Grace, you erased me from your wedding. You gave my place to Evelyn, a woman who hasn't been there for you. And you think I shouldn't take that personally?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again, looking uncomfortable. "Grace," I continued, softening my tone, "I love you. I always have. And I've done everything I could to be a part of your life. But this felt like you were telling me I'll never really belong." There was a long silence. Finally, she looked up at me, her expression conflicted. "I don't know what you want me to say." "I don't want you to say anything," I replied. "I just needed you to know how much this hurt. And I needed to tell you that going forward, things are going to be different. I can't keep giving and giving, only to be pushed aside when it matters most. If you ever want a real relationship with me, Grace, the door's open. But I'm done chasing after it." She looked startled, as if she hadn't expected me to draw a line in the sand. Peter and my husband re-entered the room then, breaking the tension. Grace stood up quickly. "We should go," she mumbled, avoiding my gaze. After they left, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. I had finally spoken my truth, even if it didn't change anything. In the days that followed, I kept replaying our conversation in my mind. Part of me hoped Grace would come around, that she'd call and apologize. But the call never came. Instead, I focused on moving forward. For the first time in years, I wasn't going to be the one reaching out. If Grace wanted me in her life, she'd have to take the first step. Until then, I was done being the invisible stepmother. I deserved better than that, and I was finally ready to start believing it.